What's on, ladies and gentlemen? My name's Ross, I like games, and today we're going to be taking a look at some new Keyforge cards. There was a live stream yesterday, I believe yesterday when I upload this, and some new cards were revealed, and you know my theory at this stage, ladies and gentlemen. When new cards are revealed, I like to be the one to come along and tell you all about them. So we're going to start off looking at Sanctum, because, well, Sanctum has just given us one of the most interesting cards that I've seen pretty much since Keyforge came out. But we're going to start off talking about Abond the Armorsmith. And I tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, lives up to his name. 3 power creature with no armor itself, but it says that other friendly creatures get +1 armor. This means all your friendly creatures get +1 armor. Now, this shouldn't particularly surprise you, it's Sanctum. Back in Wave 1, Sanctum was the armor house. Armor was not exactly something we expected to see on all of the creatures, but Sanctum had more than anyone else with the armor. Plus, we had Bulwark, that gave each of its neighbours +2 armor, and Grey Monk, that gave each friendly creature +1 armor, exactly like Abond the Armorsmith, or Abond the Armorsmith, or however it's actually pronounced. So, yeah, giving armor, this is something that we would very much expect from a Sanctum creature. But that's not all that we have here. It has an action that says for the remainder of the turn, other friendly creatures get +1 armor. Very nice indeed. Now I should say there is a very slight difference between Abond and Grey Monk. Grey Monk gives each friendly creature +1 armor, including itself, whereas Abond gives other friendly creatures +1 armor, so it's everyone but not himself. So either he's just sitting there on the field and all of your creatures get +1 armor, or you use your action, that means no reaping, no fighting, you do this instead, and all of your creatures get +2 armor. Frankly, this is pretty good. This adds up fairly quickly. I mean, let's say for argument's sake, and I know these are set 1 cards that might not be in set 2, but just as an example, Champion Tabris, who's got 2 armor, well, this would put her up to 4 armor, and then if there was a Bulwark next to her, all of a sudden you'd have a 6 power creature with 6 armor, and you'd be taking 6 less damage when you attack, so you could attack a 6 power creature, take it down, and not get any damage in return. That's pretty good. Now, carrying on the theme of characters, creatures which are hard to pronounce, Aubade the Grim? I'm going to call it Aubade the Grim, that'll have to do, ladies and gentlemen. It is a 4 power creature with 1 armor, so not huge power, but we do like the armor. When you play it, you capture 3 ember, and when you reap, you discard 1 ember from Aubade the Grim. This is actually a really nice interaction. Now, capturing means that you take ember from your opponent's pool and put it onto the character. But the rules state rather clearly that when a creature is destroyed, any ember on it goes to the other player. So you play it, you capture the free ember, but then when your opponent takes it down, they get that ember back. So what you can do here is just discard the ember, shed the ember, so that when Aubade goes down, your opponent doesn't get the ember back. And it's kind of like adding insult to injury here, the fact that this happens when you reap. You reap and gain an ember, at the same time discarding an ember, so that your opponent can't get it back when they get rid of Aubade the Grim. And it also means that your opponent is then put on a clock. I'm sure you've all had many games of Keyforge like I have, where your opponent captures a bunch of ember and you go, I'll get it in a couple of turns, I'm not worried. You just plan to take that ember in a couple of turns, because you don't need it now, so you wait until you need it, and then you take out the creature and regain all the ember on a big turn, so that you can forge a key the next turn. Well, this basically says, good luck with that. Yeah, because if you don't do that in, well, 3 turns, all that ember's going to be gone. It forces you to try and take this down and get your ember back faster than you usually would. That is not an ideal scenario. Unless you are the Aubade player, in which case, awesome. We're also getting Challe the Safeguard, 4 power, 2 armor, which incidentally is exactly what Bulwark had. And it's got Deploy. Deploy is one of these new keyword skills in set 2. Generally speaking, you have to put a new creature down on the flank. You can choose either flank, but it must go down onto a flank. What Deploy does is it allows you to put that creature anywhere in your battle line. And as we've seen in previous videos from set 2, generally speaking, well, it is without exception so far, when you put it down in the battle line, you give a bonus to your neighbours, and that's why it has the Deploy key skill. We have a match here whereby you get Deploy where you've got abilities that you want to give to your neighbours, and this is no different. You have Taunt. That means that your neighbours cannot be attacked unless they also have Taunt. So if you've got a couple of creatures that you really want to protect, maybe Abond the Armorsmith for instance, so that you can keep giving armor. Maybe Aubade the Grim, so that you can keep reaping and discarding that ember before your opponent can get it back. Then what you do is you whack this down next to the two of them, and your opponent has no choice. They cannot attack those creatures unless there's some other rule or card that says that they can. And then you gain a turn. You force your opponent to go after Challe the Safeguard. And of course, if you've got Aubade the Grim in play, hopefully next to it, hopefully getting the protection from Taunt, then you actually turn into a 4 power creature with 4 armor. That, ladies and gentlemen, is rather fun indeed. It's just a great blocker. Doesn't do a huge amount. It's an alright fighter because of the 2 armor. I mean, if you go against something like Ember Imp, for instance, which is a 2 power creature, tends to be my go-to example for 2 power creatures, I think it's a pretty annoying card. Then you can take it down without taking any damage back, which is nice. And you can always reap with it. But really, this should be there to protect a couple of your other cards. And your opponent's going to probably take it down quite quickly, because attacking that, it'll go down, and attacking either of its neighbours will end up taking it down. But while it's there, it's pretty good protection. We're also getting Smite. Now, Smite is an action card, the only action card we saw from Sanctum this time round. And when you play it, you ready and fight with a friendly creature. And you deal 2 damage to each of the attacked creature's neighbours. This is really nice. Now, as we've seen, Sanctum creatures tend to be slightly stronger than average, and they tend to have a little bit of armour, so they stay around that little bit longer. So here, not only do you get to get an extra fight rolling, but you also get to deal 2 damage to the attacked creature's neighbours. Maybe you get lucky and there's a couple of 2 power creatures and you can take them down while fighting. Best case scenario here, you actually take down 3 creatures in one go playing Smite. Now that's not going to happen all that often, don't get too excited, but it is a distinct possibility. It can happen. And remember the rule, you do as much as you can. So if your opponent has no creatures ready to go, then you ready, there's no one to fight. Oh, hang on a second. Now I can reap instead. It reminds me very much of Anger. That was one of the Brobnar cards in set 1. And it is basically the same as Anger, except you don't get the Ember bonus when you play it. Boo! But you do get to deal 2 damage to each of the creatures either side of the one you're attacking. So I'd say at least as good, just so long as your opponent has more than 1 creature on the field. Otherwise, you don't get the extra damage, and that's a bit sad. But the real highlight, the real standout from the live stream for me was Barrister Joya. 5 power, pretty good. 1 armor, pretty good. Enemy creatures can't reap. This looks like one of the more broken cards we've seen. Also, how is this Sanctum and not Dis? Dis is made for cards like this. In Wave 1, we saw stuff like Restring Guntus, which just stopped your opponent choosing a particular house. or Control the Weak, which forced your opponent to choose a particular house. There was, until an errata was issued, a great little combo you could do to literally lock your opponent out the game. I'll link that in the description. But the point is, we see those kind of cards on disc, or the Ember Imp I mentioned earlier. Your opponent cannot play more than 2 cards each turn. Generally speaking, the cards that restrict your options are discard. Well, not here. This is a Sanctum card that restricts your options. And it's an uncommon, which means you're going to be seeing it in quite a few decks. This literally stops your opponent reaping. Now, bearing in mind, some houses, I'm looking at Brobnar and Sanctum here, are very good at fighting generally, and other houses, I'm basically looking at like Shadows and Dis, are just not as good at fighting. You may well have reaping in play. You might be aiming to reap. You might have a bunch of creatures with reap skills that you want to take advantage of. Nobody cares, ladies and gentlemen. Nobody cares. This stops your opponent reaping. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to get Ember in Keyforge. Maybe you get an Ember bonus like we saw on Anger a second ago. Maybe there are skills that get you Ember. Like Urchin back in Wave 1. When you play Urchin, you get to steal an Ember. Now, admittedly, that's stealing, not gaining. You take it from your opponent, but still, it totally counts. But a lot of the time, the primary way you get Ember is reaping. You might have a deck that's got a larger than average amount of creatures. I think one of my decks has 21 creatures out of 36 cards. It's got a huge amount of creatures. And sometimes I play against a deck that's got a board wipe, like Gateway to Dis, and it's very sad. And other times my opponent doesn't have a board wipe, and I can get 14, 15, 16 creatures down and just go nuts reaping for 4, 5, 6 Ember a turn. And I generally win the game pretty quickly. Well, in comes Barrister Joya here and goes, no, you can't reap. This is as devastating as Ember Imp against certain decks. Ember Imp stops you playing cards, but you can still use cards and discard cards, and it's a 2-power creature with no armor, no skirmish, or any of that rubbish. So it's fairly easy to take down. What makes Barrister Joya even, well, better or worse depending what side of the board you're on, is the fact that it's a 5-power creature with an armor, and it's in Sanctum. I showed you Grey Monk and Bulwark from set 1. I've showed you Abond the Armorsmith from wave 2. Sanctum creatures tend to give protection. Heck, I just showed you Challe the Safeguard. So put Challe next down to a Barrister Joya, and they can't attack it, unless they've got a creature that can go through Taunt. This is redonk, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely redonk. This can literally win you the game by stopping your opponent reaping for Ember, which means they end up with quite a bit less Ember, which means they can't win the game. I feel extremely confident that there will be a great number of games that end with one of the players going, oh, I had it in hand, I had a great board setup, but they dropped a Barrister Joya and gave her armor or protected her or whatever it might be, and then I couldn't reap for Ember and I lost. This seems like a crazy over-the-top good card, and we've not seen that many of them from set 2 so far. The other one that really springs to mind is one we looked at last week, Into the Fray, which basically meant that you could ready every time you fought, so if you could find a character with skirmish, it would be nuts. Because essentially you fight, you don't take any damage back, and then the rule of 6 stops you going stupid. This looks as good as, or I would say even better than that. I am enamored. I've never been a fan of Sanctum as a house. This kind of makes me want to change my mind. So these cards look interesting, and I think Barrister Joya looks just flat out over the top great. But I would very much like to know what you think about this. So please do let me know in the comment section. Go nuts. But please do remember the rule, ladies and gentlemen. Be nice, would you? And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, and follow me on Twitter at the Wossy, where we talk Keyforge and other games. But by far the most important thing as always, look after yourselves till next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching Wossy Plays.